Good morning, bore da everybody. Welcome to the last day of the conference. We've got a fun-filled morning for you today. I'm Karen Stothard. I head up the International Biodiversity within Welsh Government. And I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're going to be covering in the session today, just so you've got a heads up. So during the conference this morning, we're going to have a session on the forthcoming conference of parties known as COP15. We're going to also hear about a programme which has been designed to increase knowledge and training around biodiversity in Wales and how that's been going. We're also then going to hear from Sam Ward in Climate Cymru, who has been doing some work with the citizens of Wales to find out what they feel about nature and what they would like us to do. And then finally, we're going to hear from Russell, who is going to talk to us about nature and us, Natarani. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Georgina Chandler, who will talk to you this morning about how Wales can deliver the global biodiversity goals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and lovely to be here. Nice to see you all. I hope you have had a fun and an interesting week this week. So just to introduce myself very quickly, I'm Georgina. I work at the RSPB in our global policy team, and that is a team mainly dealing with global conventions and also projects overseas that we have as RSPB. I work very specifically on conventions, so on what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also the UNFCCC, which is the Climate Change Conference. So yeah, nice to be here. Next slide. So some of you may be aware of what the Convention on Biological Diversity is, but many people haven't heard of this elusive global process that seems very big and far away. So what actually is the Convention on Biological Diversity? Well, it's the overarching United Nations framework for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. It was formed the same year as the other Rio conventions, including the UNFCCC. So that's the Climate Change Conference. Many of you will have been aware of COP26, which happened in Glasgow last year. And also at the same time, there was also an agreement to tackle desertification, so the UNCCD that was formed. So these three, what we call sister conventions, were agreed in Rio in 1992. And all countries of the world come together at the Convention on Biological Diversity, with the exception of the United States and the Vatican, to make decisions and agree targets for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So for the last decade, you might be familiar with the Aichi biodiversity targets that were agreed in Japan in 2010. They came to an end in 2020, and we are now in the process of agreeing a new global biodiversity framework for the next decade. Next slide. So why should we care about CBD and why should we care about COP15? So the Convention on Biological Diversity, as I said, is the overarching framework for nature loss and tackling that problem globally. The Aichi targets were not a success. We got to 2020, and I think it is fair to say that globally, collectively, and also domestically, we failed to meet the majority of the 20 targets that we signed up to in 2010. So now with a refresh and the establishment of a new framework, we have an opportunity to agree a new transformational agenda with the potential to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030. And there's more attention on nature now than I think there has been in recent years. And there's a real opportunity globally to transform this framework and really make it work for action and success on the ground. So a successful COP15 will also send signals that things are changing and that governments are willing to commit to ambitious action globally. And this can have a real impact on the real economy, as we've seen from kind of commitments that happened at Paris and how that has translated into national strategies and into businesses and into how the The CBD is also a critical tool for leveraging domestic action, which my colleague Muriel will talk a little bit about later on in the presentation. And governments have to translate this global framework into their national strategies and action plans and report on their progress globally. So there's a real opportunity for accountability on a global stage as well. Next slide. So it's been quite a journey to get to this point where we're leading up to COP15, and I'm aware that I'm using acronyms quite liberally in this presentation. So COP15 is the Conference of the Parties, and that's just a name that is given to a UN meeting where all of the governments and countries that have signed up to that agreement come together. So a COP is not something that's exclusive to one process or another. That's why the UNFCCC had COP26. That was just the 26th meeting of the UNFCCC. And this is the 15th meeting of the CBD Conference of Parties. And it's half the amount of the UNFCCC because it meets every 2 years, whereas the UNFCCC meets every year. So that's just a little bit of a debunking of what a COP is. And as I was saying, it has been a long road to get to COP15. 2020 was supposed to be a super year for nature with the biodiversity and the Glasgow climate agreement happening. But for obvious reasons and due to COVID, the CBD has come up against considerable challenges and delays. A lot of this has been exacerbated by the fact that the host country, China, who's supposed to be president and hosting COP15, they have very stringent domestic COVID policies that have meant while COP26 could go ahead last year in the UK, and we found a way to make that happen. China's domestic COVID policy meant that we are still waiting for COP15 to happen. And in fact, they've moved the conference from China to a new venue in Montreal in Canada. It will still be hosted by China, but Canada is the home of the CBD Secretariat. So that was a logical place and a neutral place for them to host the Conference of the Parties because China was unable to. Unfortunately, these delays have locked in quite a bit of inertia. We were supposed to be building up to this big moment in 2020, and it makes it very difficult for organisations and for governments to do campaigning, to engage in the process if we don't have a kind of clear idea of when this big meeting is going to happen. It makes it hard to kind of mobilise momentum behind that. So we finally have a date for COP15, so it'll be the second week of December through to the 20th of December in Montreal in Canada. So we have a big job to do over the next few months to continue to build that momentum and galvanise support for an ambitious outcome at COP15. Next slide. So this is just an illustration. You don't have to understand any of the words that are on this slide, but it's just an illustration of the journey that we've been on and the journey that I personally have been on in engaging with the development of this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And as you can see, we're in the final stages. We've just had the meeting, the pre-negotiations in Nairobi in June, and we're at that final box. Finally, we will be having COP15, the final negotiations of the actual content of the Global Biodiversity Framework this December. So a lot of work and effort has gone into this process. And yeah, it'll culminate at the end of this year. Next slide. So just to kind of give you a flavour of what the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework looks like, it's not just a kind of set of targets. There's a theory of change, and there's a series of different elements that make up the post-2020 framework. At the top, there's the 2030 missional goal, and many people are advocating for this to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030. So something that focuses very much on recovery, on restoration. We're in the UN decade on restoration, so this is an incredibly important sentiment for the UN as well. Underneath this missional goal, there will be a series of 5 goals that cover everything from outcomes on species and ecosystems, outcomes on resource mobilization and finance, outcomes on ecosystem services. So the idea is that the goals will be very much focused on the change that we want to see in the world as a result of the actions that countries will be taking. So they're outcome orientated goals. And then underneath these goals, there are 3 clusters of targets. At the moment, there are 21 targets. The first cluster very much deals with reducing threats to biodiversity. So that's where we have action on protected areas, invasive species, things to prevent species extinctions, tackling pollution. So all of those kind of pressures and drivers of biodiversity loss and the actions we should be taking to prevent those. Cluster 2 is about meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. So that's very much about biodiversity, not just from a conservation perspective, but also recognizing this is central to a lot of people's livelihoods in the world, and how are we going to make sure that they still have rights and engagement with this process. And cluster 3 is about the tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming, which sounds very waffly, but basically this is things like having the finance and the financial commitments to actually make sure that this happens, that we can do this framework and that we can implement it successfully. And then down the side, you can see not only is there a kind of framework of targets and goals, but there's also commitments on enabling conditions. So this is things like your monitoring, reporting and verification, which is very relevant at the national level, because this is something that Wales will be doing independently, the same as Scotland, Northern Ireland and England, sort of reporting up to the UK level and then reporting up to the CBD. So those are your mechanisms for kind of accountability, for finance, for capacity building. Next slide. So what does success look like at COP15? How will we know that we have an ambitious framework? I've already mentioned this 2030 nature positive mission or goal to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030. We also want to see an ambitious set of 2030 goals to prevent extinctions, recover species populations, and retain and restore habitat quality and extent. And there are specific asks associated with that, but I won't go into that level of detail in this presentation. And we want to see a prominent target on the protected area agenda, so to protect and conserve effectively at least 30% of land and seas by 2030, something that governments in the UK have already signed up to. We want to see ambitious action-orientated targets and pledges to tackle those key pressures and drivers of biodiversity loss, and a framework that's underpinned by the resources that are needed to actually implement it. Next slide. So how do we as the RSPB engage with the CBD? Just very briefly, we're a science-based organisation, so we've been working very hard on a lot of the evidence base for what we think the different percentages, asks, text should look like, and providing the kind of evidence base for that, and then translating that into language and policy asks that we want to see reflected in the framework and advocating for those. And in the lead up to COP15, we'll also be engaging with some campaigning, making sure that the pressure is there for an ambitious outcome at COP15, and the high level political buy-in is also there, both domestically and globally as well. And I think it's important to say that RSPB is the UK partner of BirdLife International, so we work with and through all of our BirdLife partners on the ground in different countries. So when we go to the COP15 negotiations, we go there with a delegation from all over the world representing BirdLife partners from different countries, and we work with them on all of these different elements as well. Next slide. So before I hand over to my colleague Muriel, just to reiterate kind of how all of this high-level global framework relates to the national level. So as I've mentioned, the actual two things that you have to do when you sign up to the Convention on Biological Diversity is make a plan on how you're going to implement the targets that you've signed up to, and then report on your progress towards those targets. So this is something called the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and within the UK, each of the 4 countries has one of those from 2010, from when the IHE targets were agreed. And looking forward, once we have our agreement at COP15, there will be a process where governments will be expected to update and revise and realign their national strategies with the new global framework. And that's a quite important process to engage with. So if you have any questions about the CBD or anything that I've mentioned in this presentation or points of clarification, I look forward to talking to you about them. So I'll pass over to my colleague Muriel now.
Thank you, Georgina. That was great. And yes, please do pop any questions that you have in the chat, because we have got time for questions after the presentation finishes. My name's Muriel Harrison. I'm a Nature Policy Officer in the Policy and Advocacy team at RSPB Cymru. And so I'm going to bring things a little bit closer to home now that Georgina's explained all of the international context, and talk about what this means for Wales, and particularly the need for legally binding nature recovery targets in Wales, so that we can play our part in achieving the global targets that are due to be set at COP15. So to start, in terms of where we're at with progress towards having these nature targets in Wales, we did have a bit of a landmark moment in June last year, where the Senedd declared a nature emergency, and that included calling on the Welsh Government to introduce a legally binding requirement to reverse biodiversity loss through the means of statutory targets. And following that, last December, the Labour and Plaid Cymru cooperation agreement recognised the role that targets have to play in helping to protect and restore biodiversity. And then, of course, most recently, at the beginning of this week, this conference opened with the recommendations from the Welsh Government's biodiversity deep dive into how the target to protect 30% of Wales's land and sea for nature by 2030 could be achieved, and those recommendations being announced by the Minister here at the conference. And that included a recommendation for legislation for nature recovery targets to be laid as early as possible in this Senedd term. So some really encouraging progress there. And just to say, a lot of what's in my slides today draws on this report that we published last year along with WWF Cymru and Wales Environment Link. And this was a report written by Stuart Housden for us, and it is quite a long report. I've put the link there in case you want to investigate it later. But the report was called Putting Wales on a Path to Nature Recovery, and really it sets out the case for developing and implementing legally binding nature recovery targets in Wales. One of the things that Stuart looked at in the report was where Wales is already using targets-based approaches to tackle other environmental challenges. And he looked in particular at recycling and waste, climate and air quality, and at what the shared lessons learned could be from the approaches that have been taken there in terms of the factors that have underpinned the success that Wales has had in, for example, increasing recycling, reducing waste, and the movement that we're seeing towards having some really clear air quality targets and towards net zero. And the lessons that Stuart identified were the importance of having clear targets and duties that are established in law, having smart implementation plans, and smart in this context means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So being clear, really clear about what you're going to do and how you're going to get there. Having regular monitoring and review and reporting to provide that kind of accountability for delivery, being led by independent expert advice in terms of setting targets, and having the resources to fund the action that's needed to meet them. There was also something around having powers for public bodies to be able to tackle any blockers that are getting in the way of progress, and having engagement right across government departments with ministers working together to deliver a coherent and ambitious response. So thinking about how that would apply to nature targets in Wales, I think it's useful to just stand back for a moment and think about the environmental framework that we have in Wales already. We've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that came in 2015, establishing the wellbeing goals, the reporting by public bodies against that, and the suite of national indicators and milestones, which includes an indicator on the status of biological diversity in Wales. And that obviously also established the role of the Future Generations Commissioner. Following that, the Environment Act came in 2016, introducing sustainable management of natural resources. The sonar reports, which are so critical to knowing what's going on in our natural environment in Wales, the natural resources policy and area statements, and the biodiversity and ecosystem resilience duty that we have in Wales. And the Nature Recovery Action Plan is quite key to all of this. Georgina talked about the countries needing to have those national biodiversity strategies and action plans under the CBD. And the NRAP, the Nature Recovery Action Plan, is that for Wales. That's what the NRAP is doing for Wales. And so it was established under the last round of CBD targets, but it will be refreshed now following the COP15 in December to be the biodiversity strategy and action plan for delivering those new targets. And so thinking about what's needed to strengthen this framework, and the targets are going to be really crucial to that. Having the smart targets, having formal links between that legislation and the NRAP, which is setting out the actions that are going to get us towards the targets, having clear accountability for delivery, having that mainstreaming across government, and having adequate resource for delivery as well. So the report by Stuart Housden came up with some clear recommendations about what setting targets would look like in legislative terms. And these are the components that are recommended to be in primary legislation. So we would have an overarching new duty on the Welsh Government to embed and integrate nature recovery and environmental protection across government. So that would be expressing the kind of key high-level objectives. A duty to halt and begin to reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030 and achieve recovery by 2050, which would be in line with that proposed global goal that we're hoping to see cemented at COP15. Cemented is probably not a good word in this context. And a duty then to set long-term and interim targets via a comprehensive framework of targets, informed by expertise and advice, and aligned with the post-2020 global framework. So what this means is the full suite of targets wouldn't need to be in the primary legislation. It's likely to take some more time to develop the detail of those, but what would go into the primary legislation is the duty to do that. And I think our ideal would be that those targets would be set in 5-year cycles, which would match with the climate plan or the Senedd term, and that they would be subject to regular review and scrutiny. And then finally, having a legal requirement on ministers to ensure that the targets are met. And that's going to be vital to help us get out of the kind of too little, too late approaches that we've seen in the past. So I talked about establishing a framework of targets within secondary legislation. And just to look at that in more detail for a moment, what that would mean is having a suite of targets that would apply to terrestrial, marine and freshwater environments. And we would like those to cover at a minimum species abundance, species distribution and extinction risk, habitat quality, extent and connectivity, and the condition and extent of protected sites. So this is really covering kind of all of the detail that you need to know that nature is recovering and what progress is being made. In thinking about targets in Wales, it's helpful to look outside of Wales for a moment and think about what's going on elsewhere in the UK and the EU, with COP15 on the horizon in December. What we've seen in the last few years is a series of quite high-level commitments from the UK government as COP's been approaching. So we've had the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. We've had the UK playing a prominent role in the High Ambition Coalition. And we had the G7 2030 Nature Compact signed last year as well. So we've been hearing good things from the UK government. Of course, we do now have a new Prime Minister and a new set of ministers. And I think there's a bit of a question mark there. You know, it remains to be seen how committed this new administration is going to be to all of this. In England, the Environment Act last year was a landmark piece of legislation in England, and it set a legally binding target to halt species declines by 2030. So there is a high-level target in legislation now in England and a requirement to set further targets underneath that. And those targets have been out for consultation this year, with proposals there for targets around species abundance, extinction risk, wildlife-rich habitat creation, and the condition of marine protected areas. And we'll see what happens with this government in terms of the targets it's going to set. I think it's got to do them by the end of this month, so the clock is ticking. In Scotland, there's a commitment to legislate very soon for a statutory targets framework that will halt declines by 2030 and make significant restoration progress by 2045. And in Northern Ireland, there's a draft environment strategy which does have a commitment to legislate for some global targets, and it sets out some domestic targets, but at the moment those are non-binding. In the EU, there's a new 2030 biodiversity strategy, and one of the big developments there is the proposed restoration law, which would set out binding targets for the restoration of areas, habitats and species, and that would require the member states to set targets domestically as well. For anyone who's really interested to go into more detail in terms of the targets that are emerging in the EU and the UK in the post-Brexit environment, the Institute for European Environmental Policy published a really good report yesterday that we contributed to, and I've put the link in there that talks about these things in more detail. And it also discusses some of the kind of pros and cons of alignment. And that's something that Wales will need to think about in setting its own targets, to what extent it's beneficial to align with what's being done elsewhere in the UK or in the EU versus sort of forging its own path. And there are definitely pros and cons when you look at alignment. You know, it can be a race to the top. It could spur competition and countries wanting to do better than each other. It could also be a race to the bottom and you know, everyone doing the bare minimum. So there's a lot to think about there, but definitely an opportunity as Wales looks to set its own targets to kind of analyse what's happening elsewhere and learn from the targets that are being set in other contexts. So finally, with targets really on the horizon now in Wales, I wanted to just think for a moment about what level of ambition we're seeing in Wales from the government that we have here. As I've mentioned, we've got this forward-looking legislative framework in Wales already that gives us some good foundations to build on, and I think that's, you know, in the past it's given Wales a bit of a reputation as a kind of forward-looking and environmentally focused government. So we want to see that reputation upheld and the targets legislation coming in to build on that. The biodiversity deep dive has been really positive in terms of showing that the Welsh Government is really serious about delivering on its commitments. It committed to the 30 by 30 target, and you know, it's coming through with the actions that are needed to deliver that. But we do need to recognise that that's just one target within the framework, and what we need is a whole suite of targets and the detail in them. And we also do at the moment have a proposed national milestone for biological diversity in Wales within that framework under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But at the moment, the way that those national milestones work, they have to be based on single indicators. So at the moment, it's just based on species distribution for quite a narrowly focused group of species. So it's a really helpful statement of ambition, because the way it's articulated does talk about halting loss and starting recovery by 2030, which is what we want to see. But it really highlights the need for more work across a wider suite of indicators to measure progress towards a wider suite of targets. So in summary, if we're going to get to a nature positive Wales, what we need is a smart and legally binding framework of targets that are aligned with that COP15 global biodiversity framework and supported by accountability, mainstreaming and resourcing. And we've heard from the Minister how positive she is about COP15 and that she wants to set targets for Wales in the context of what's agreed there. So we're hopeful for really swift action to start the work to develop the detail of those targets, so that when it's time to lay that legislation, we're really ready to kind of hit the ground running for Wales in the way that we need to. Thanks very much. It's time now for any questions that anyone would like to ask, either for Georgina or myself.
Thank you, Mariel and Georgina. That was a really interesting presentation. We've got one question that's come in from Russell in the chat so far. So I'll just read that out for the benefit of everybody else. And I'd just like to encourage other people to continue putting questions in the chat if they've got any questions. So there are, of course, downsides to targets, and in that they can actually drive the wrong actions. The UN IPBES report talks about the need for wider systems transformation across food, energy and mobility systems. Did your report consider how these can be interlinked?
So this is presumably about the nature targets report for Wales that I was talking about. It didn't go into that level of detail specifically. It was focused on the nature recovery targets, but of course we do recognise the need to be looking wider. And there's already a really clear focus through Welsh Government on mainstreaming action for climate. And for example, we're really clear on the need to be considering nature and climate together, because what's good for one isn't necessarily always good for the other, and you need to be aware of any trade-offs that you're making and identify where you can take actions that are benefiting both. But I think in terms of downsides to targets and them driving the wrong actions, it is also important to bear in mind that the issues that we've had with the past rounds of the CBD and the targets that have been set is that they haven't sufficiently translated into domestic action. We know that biodiversity is still suffering as a result of that. We know we haven't made the progress that people have set out to make in the past. And it seems quite clear now at international and domestic levels that part of the reason for that is that implementation hasn't had good enough binding targets. They haven't been followed through with legislation and the requirements and accountability for governments to actually deliver what they're promising. I don't know whether Georgina has anything else to say on that.
Yeah, I think it also links to the question that Sorrel just put in the chat as well, which I can answer because it leads on from this in terms of why is it going to be different this time around. So I think I think it's important to recognise that targets aren't gonna solve everything. It's part of a wider package of action and kind of commitments to change things in a broader system. But I think we can look at to the UNFCCC. You can argue it's not going far enough, fast enough, but the agreement in Paris really triggered kind of a real shift in how we think about our energy systems and where we place our investment. So I think that's a real sort of tribute to global agreements and cooperation, and how they really can trigger change in the real economy and drive investment into different areas. So I think that's really important to have in mind. And this time around, things can be different. I think there are some fundamental things that we're trying to change within the new global biodiversity frameworks, and one of them is accountability. So when Marielle's been talking about the kind of national biodiversity strategies and action plans and kind of reporting progress against those, one of the big issues we had with the Aichi targets was there was no standardization. So you couldn't compare countries' progress against each other. So there was basically no accountability. And if there's no accountability, what is motivating you to actually do the thing that you signed up to? And that's very different in the UNFCCC, because there is a clear, comparable commitment and reporting process. So you can see what countries' kind of commitments are towards 1.5. You can tell whether they are sufficient enough, and you can call them out if they're not. And that's something we really don't have within the CBD process, which we have an opportunity to change this time around with a bit more standardization and accountability. And I think that really is quite a strong motivator for implementation. The other two things is political will and buy-in. So really, we've seen over the last decade biodiversity continuing to rise on the political agenda. We could have a leaders summit at COP15 with not just kind of ministers, but with heads of state. And that's not something we've had for biodiversity before. We saw it in 2020 around the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. We've seen it at the G7 and the recent UN General Assembly. Like, this is now coming up on a head of state level agenda, which means it's top down, it's bottom up, but it is more likely to get traction inside governments, and it's more likely to get that kind of political buy-in and momentum that's really, really important. And then lastly, the other thing is within the framework itself, making those targets more specific, more measurable, more action orientated, so that it's really clear what we're trying to achieve, when and how. And again, that's something that the Aichi targets didn't really have. So yeah, I am hopeful that these things can drive change. But as I said, they're part of a broader package of things from local all the way up to the global. And you can't just, there's no one silver bullet for tackling these crises, but all of these processes have a part to play.
Thank you both. The next question is around how we need to link the actions to delivering across the policy areas. For example, the example in the chat is around creating broadleaf woodlands rather than soft woods for timber. So I don't know whether either of you'd like to comment on that. I mean, I can come in on the back if you need to talk about the NRAP refresh, but I'll hand to you two first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, it'd be really helpful to have you come in on the NRAP refresh, certainly. I think what I was going to say on this one is the deep dive has actually been a really useful exercise, I think, in showing how once you start to set targets and then you look at the implications of achieving those, you naturally do start to look across all of the relevant policy areas at the action that's going to be needed to meet the ambition you're setting. So, you know, within the deep dive, RSPB Cymru was represented on the core expert group for the deep dive, and we saw the really wide-ranging discussions that happened there. You know, it was looking at quite a focused target in terms of protecting 30% of land and sea, but you very quickly see how you need to look at the role of planning, policy, what's going on with land management and the new sustainable farming scheme. All of these things are vital to achieving those targets. So I feel sort of confident that in setting targets, those discussions then do follow, because you have to really look at how you're realistically going to achieve those things. But yeah, Karen, did you want to come in?
Yeah, yes, in the presentation, I think Georgina or yourself outlined the fact that we have this commitment to deliver a national biodiversity strategy, or MBSAP as they're known as. So we are sort of making plans to do that, and that the Minister has committed that will be an action that we will take forward post COP15. And as Muriel has indicated, we've been having discussions fairly broadly already across Welsh Government. So we've got something called a biodiversity task force, which is looking at how we embed biodiversity across Welsh Government. And through that, we've done things like we've mapped the targets and policy areas together. So, some preparatory work is being done right across the piece in this area. So I hope that helps, Claire. We do have other questions, so I'll just move on. So we've got a question from Neil Lambert about the session yesterday. Polled 50% felt, sorry, I can't read. Despite all the high-level policy change, it does not lead to much progress on the ground, but 31% felt that Wales is moving too slowly and getting left behind progress in other countries. We've missed the 2010 and 2020 targets, and we've seen primary legislation without this moving into secondary legislation and policy at pace. I'm trying to get to what the question actually is.
I think it's a comment, really, isn't it?
I think it's a comment.
Things
yes.
are moving out in terms of legislation, and yes, we would like to see things moving faster in terms of the legislation coming in to set these targets. There are real challenges there, and we are seeing other countries moving ahead of Wales in some cases on things like environmental governance. Wales is now the only UK country that hasn't managed to establish its own environmental governance body post Brexit, and that's going to be part of the legislation that brings in the targets as well. So we see a really urgent need for both of those things, and as I set out in my presentation, we're of the view that you don't need to have all of the detail before you start working on the legislation. You need to legislate to get the framework in place that enables you to set the targets, and you can be developing those targets at the same time. So yeah, we're really keen to see the legislation to do this come through as soon as possible.
Thank you, Muriel. There's a comment from Russell Diath on behaviour change, which I agree we do need to do a lot on behaviour change too. It's not just about the target setting at that high level. There's a lot of work to do underneath that. So I'm going to leave that as a comment there. I just want to note that Liz's point around the greater transparency about the Nature Recovery Action Plan and the implementation group with the meeting dates. So as Georgina has flagged, there's a greater need for transparency right across the piece in terms of our reporting. So I feel that this will be something that will be tackled as part of that process as well. So, we'll need to be more accountable, and that will be built into the future programme. And then one last comment from Alison. One of the takeaways from the conference is the increase in action that's happening, which is heartening. That's really nice to hear. But not much mention about us or any of the policies stopping doing things, much the same as reducing energy in the same ways has been very slow to get going. What can we do about this that as part of the NRAP review of Welsh Government policies and targets, etc. So, Muriel, Georgina, do you want to answer the what can we all do part and give your views on that? I'm happy to come in afterwards if you like.
Yeah, I think there's always a role for individual action, isn't there, and action at all scales, and I think awareness of that is increasing, and we're going to hear from Russell later, aren't we, and from Sam, some of the sort of voices and views of people in Wales coming through in terms of what they're doing for nature, but I think what also comes through in those conversations is the desire for this to be led from the top as well, and the kind of recognition that it's the Welsh government and the UK government have the biggest levers to pull in all of this to make the changes for nature. You know, things like farming policy in Wales. So much of our land is farmed that's absolutely crucial to what happens for nature. So absolutely, I don't want to underplay the role of individual action and of local level action that, for example, councils can take by managing their recreational areas and road verges and things slightly differently to make more space for nature. But I think we do need to see this led from the top as well.
Okay, I'm going to call a halt to the questions now, just because time's marching on and we need to move on to the next speaker. So I would just like to thank you once again, Mariel and Georgina, for your really interesting presentation today. It was really clear, give a really good, clear overview of what COP15 is and what we're trying to achieve. And hopefully, you know, moving forward into December, we will be looking at you know, getting that agreement and that ambitious framework, so that we can then translate that into action and activity in Wales. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to NatureWise, who are going to be talking about the Wales-based literacy programme and training programme that they've been developing in Wales. So I'll hand over now to Claire and to Sarah Wynne, please.
Lovely, thank you very much, Karen. So my name is Claire Sailorberry. I'm joined by my colleague Sarah Wynne Parry. We both work for Climate Cymru, which is a sustainable development organisation in Wales. We run an eco-literacy training programme called NatureWise, which some of you may be aware of. And this presentation is just to share our journey with you about why we saw the need to develop the course, how we've gone about it, and what we are seeing the impacts as being, as well as future developments as well. So we do have some slides, which I'll ask Sarah to share now. Thanks, Sarah. If you go on to the first one. Okay, so as I said, we're from Climate Cymru. We are a sustainable development organisation. We're also the living wage accreditation body for Wales. So we do a lot of work around sustainability in different forms, and whether that's sort of decarbonisation or working within the private sector, we have lots of different audiences and stakeholders. We've focused a lot on the climate emergency, I suppose, well, for years since our start, but a few years ago we were really conscious of the need to help raise awareness of the nature crisis as well. It didn't seem to have the same attention or regard in any of the circles that we were working in, and we were thinking, well, you know, we're not policy folk, we don't really influence policy, we're certainly not practitioners, we don't take practical action. Where is our role in the biodiversity crisis? And then we thought, well, what we do quite successfully is training, and encouraging people to feel able to find their place in these big global challenges and to take action that can make a difference. Can you go on to the next slide, Sarah? So we're aware, probably neither of these images are new to you, that yeah, although we know that we are in a state of crisis, a lot of people don't see it, and particularly with nature, you know, look out of the window, it's like, well, I can see some birds, I can see a few trees, you know, what's wrong? So we perceived, you know, a really big need, not to patronise people, but just to recognise that unless you study this in biology or whatever, it doesn't come up very often. In everyday conversations, sort of the way ecosystems work, and certainly the nature crisis isn't talked about. I mean, it's talked about more now, but it's not sort of an everyday conversation. And we thought perhaps we could help address that through developing a course. So could you go on to the next slide, Sarah? This was our idea for the course, to help people understand the links between human activity and ecosystem disruption. So to understand how ecosystems function and some of the threats that they're under, and how that will ultimately affect human beings as well as the other species on the planet. And give people knowledge and confidence, whether they were working in community groups or as individuals or in professional organisations, to take action for nature recovery. We have been really lucky to be supported in this endeavour by Welsh Government, by Karen's team. We had developed a course that we thought would work, and with funding from Welsh Government from the Section 6 team, we were able to pilot that then with a number of organisations. So all those four listed were supremely helpful in helping us test this course. We also did a presentation to the Wales Biodiversity Conference a couple of years ago, and from that we have some volunteers that helped us as a working group to road test some of the material, to test our messages, to make sure that we were including the most up-to-date information, and to make sure that the way that we were presenting and sharing what is some quite, devastating information, we could do that in a way that didn't bring people into that paralysis of despair, but did make them feel enabled to take action. So on the back of that and those successful pilots, we were able to get enough evidence about the course's efficacy and the need to apply for funding. Sorry, could you go back, Sarah? Thanks. Apply for funding from Co-op Foundation to be able to run this course for free for community groups. Climate Cymru is a not-for-profit organisation. We charge for a lot of our services, well, to cover our costs. We don't make private profit, but we are working with the private and public sector a lot. So whilst we wanted to maintain that as a business model and to be able to offer this course on a fee-paying basis for organisations that could afford to, we also recognise that community groups and voluntary organisations just don't have that resource. So we had funding from Co-op Foundation to put on these courses for free for community groups, and they started back in September 21. We also recognise that Climate Cymru is one organisation. Wales is, everyone says it's a small country, but it's still, quite a big place with a lot of people, and that we saw a really big need for sort of eco-literacy, that was something that couldn't be delivered just by us. So within that funding proposal was also funding to help bring on board 2 community partners that could also deliver the course. So we had a kind of NatureWise network of trainers. If you move on, thanks, Sarah. So in terms of where we've got to, since that initial pilot just over, or the first courses being advertised a year ago. Oh, sorry, Sarah, the slides are moving on. There we go.
Sorry, Claire.
We've been running the course sort of in its beyond the pilot phase for just over a year, and this is where we have got to. We've been very fortunate to have this continued support of Welsh Government. So we do run the course on a fee-paying basis for civil servants, which has been brilliant. We have trained almost 100 civil servants in NatureWise, either in cross-department courses or specific departmental courses. So we did a NatureWise for transport officials course that could sort of dive a bit more deeply into the transport related actions, I suppose, that are beneficial for nature recovery. But we've trained people from all sectors. As part of the course, we explain to people how ecosystems work. We take a lot of our evidence from IPBES, from State of Nature, from really credible resources to explain the drivers of biodiversity loss and the way that our natural systems are changing. We encourage people to reflect a lot about how they notice those changes within their own lifetimes and the impacts that they might be having on people's own lives. We encourage a lot of interaction between attendees to share experiences. So we're trying to make the nature crisis really relatable and real. And as part of that, we ask people to come up with an action plan at the end of the course about how they see the best ways that they can contribute to nature recovery, either in their work lives or their personal lives. And it could be practical action, it could be lifestyle choices, or it could be working to influence and motivate others. So we collect all that data just to see where people's interests and passions are and to get an idea of impact. So we've trained almost 200 people. We've had these 535 actions for nature pledged. We follow up with people 3 months on after they attend the course to find out how they're getting on with their action plans. Not everybody responds to that, but the responses that we do have been really positive, suggesting that for some people, this sort of course is a real eye-opener and it can lead to sort of long-term changes in the way they live and the way that they have conversations with others. In terms of the course's impact, sorry, Sar, still on the arrows, we do polls before and after the course, and we ask people about how much they feel they know about nature and ecosystems, and also how confident they are to act. And we're really pleased that on average, attendees by the end of the course feel that their knowledge and their confidence has doubled as a result of taking the course, which, you know, is the sort of result that we were hoping for. So that is where we are. That's a really brief sort of timeline of how NatureWise as our eco-literacy course has developed. And I'll hand over to Sarah now to kind of explain a bit more about the ethos of the course and some of the things that we've learned through doing it. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so I'm just going to share some reflections with you and things that we feel that have worked so far on the course. We start the course by showing a video some of you might have already seen. It was commissioned by Welsh Government and it's called My Relationship to Trees in Wales. And it's just a way, I'm sorry, I don't know, the timer has come on this again. So yeah, it's just a way of grounding people as they introduce themselves, and then we also ask them for one word that describes how nature makes them feel. And it's just a great way of getting people to connect with nature even whilst they're just sitting on Zoom. And the course is run over 2 morning sessions, normally a Tuesday and a Thursday, with a little bit of homework in between. And all we do is ask people to go outside, maybe go for a walk or just go to their garden or wherever they can. And we ask them to observe their surroundings and look for various things that we've covered in the first session, and maybe find an example of maybe an ecosystem or habitat, something that attracts their attention, and then ask them to take a photo, or if they're feeling creative, they can express, sorry, this is all going to be spoiled, isn't it? Can't stop it. So yeah, just any way that they want to express themselves. So we've had some brilliant poems, some of them written off the cuff, or some people have written them before the course but inspired by nature and they want to share, like this one here. We've also had people sketch their observations, like this really lovely photo here that you can see. And even some study pieces like this, just a really lovely activity to do, and most people come back really excited to share something. We've even had somebody share a piece of music that they composed inspired by the Elan Valley. But there's no pressure to be creative. We've all got phones, and I think it's a great way for people to share and compensate for not delivering outdoors. And just an example of some of the observations people come back with here. We get lots of pictures of kind of micro and macro ecosystems, participants sharing tips on nature-friendly gardening hacks like the bug hotel in the right. We've had community councillors inspired to improve habitats in local graveyards, and even pictures of garden DIY projects to brainstorm ideas of incorporating nature-friendly areas. And like this quote says here, it's just a really good way of getting people to really look at their local spaces or gardens, something that they probably walk past countless times, probably thinking about what they're going to have for tea, or some, or, you know, worrying about work or some email they have to reply for. But it's just getting people to look with a fresh pair of eyes again. So just to show you some of the feedback that we've had up to now from participants. Like Claire said, we've had nearly 200 people on the course now, and they range from volunteers to community councillors to local authority officers, academics, and yeah, nearly 100 Welsh Government officials. And you know, the people with no environmental background to top experts and ecologists and policymakers on the course. And most people go away inspired to take action, or even find ways of reimagining how they can communicate or deliver their work. And part of what we do with the Welsh Government courses is to get everyone to think about how they can individually feed into their department biodiversity action plans. And that's something that we follow up with as well 3 months later. So we've noted a huge increase in confidence of participants, and you know, that ranges from the science and how that connects to real life, helping people feel empowered to take action or even engage others around the nature emergency. And the course content, it mainly focuses on habitat connectivity, encouraging people to take action, but promoting the do no harm message. We try to inspire and encourage positive action on things like supporting the food webs, you know, something that we all have the power to kind of do and take action on ourselves. And we promote and signpost people to best practice and useful resources, and encourage people to seek advice from local experts such as biodiversity officers or the local nature partnership officers, specific conservation organisations if topics come up, and other local groups in their areas. And I think the main points that we've kind of learned up to now is that you can't underestimate how little people know. Like Claire mentioned, you know, for many generations, it just wasn't common practice to kind of teach the basics of ecology at school level. And unless you've got a personal interest in it, quite often this is just not something you will, you know easily. And you can't underestimate the enthusiasm of people once they realise how much power they have to make changes in their lives and in their workplace. So future plans, we're currently in discussions with a number of organisations around delivering bespoke courses, and we've got a series of urban focused courses coming up, funded through Great Western Railways in the South Wales area. If people are interested, we can put this information in chat or share with people if you want to share with your contacts as well. And we're also talking to NRW at the moment about a number of different avenues we could tailor the course, and including delivering on-site courses with our network partner Llynpac Mawr on Anglesey, which is on an NRW site. And we have also had a number of inquiries about delivering the course in Welsh. And for us, the course is, about connecting people in a personal and creative way. So we wanted to make sure the Welsh version was meaningful, not just a kind of a straight up translation. As a Welsh speaker, I'm very aware that we could miss a lot. So we're currently talking to a number of people about how we can go about this, and we're also going to set up a working group. So if there are any interested people who would like to be involved with that, we would, love for you to come on board. We're just trying to gather ideas and suggestions. So yeah, please let us know if you are interested in that. I'll pass you on to Claire now.
Brill, thanks, Sarah. So it's really nice to see in the chat that some people have said, oh, I'm interested in those courses. We'd love your help to promote them. That's our email address, training@cynnelcymru.com, or you can reach me on Claire@ or Sarah at. Quite straightforward. Yeah, please get in touch because we'd really appreciate help promoting those courses, and they are free to any volunteer, staff member, trustee of any community group or voluntary organisation working in those areas, which are the areas along the GWR mainland stations.
Thank you both, Claire and Sarah, for that really interesting presentation. As you know, I am a huge advocate of this course, and I'm really particularly interested in and sort of pleased with the way that the course has asked people to develop those action plans, so that you're not just attending a course, you're actually taking something away from that so that you can actually make a difference and implement that in your daily life. And I'm also keen on the fact that you follow up on that as well. I think I'd be interested in seeing a bit of an analysis of some of those impacts that could be coming out of your course at some point, but I think we can take that as another conversation. Anyway, we have a few comments and questions in the chat, so we've got a few minutes. I'll just whiz to the top of them. So Cass has asked, how are these interactions shared? Are they privately as part of the session, or can they be viewed anywhere by the general public?
Yeah, at the moment, we keep threatening to publish the Nature-Wise poetry book because we've had quite a few poems now. They're shared in the session. We do ask for permission if we can keep and share them. Not everyone wants to give permission, which is fine. But probably about 70% do. So we are thinking about ways to perhaps make those available, linked to that sort of analysis that you've said, Karen, about, what moves people, where do they feel that they can act. We've got some really good learning, and some of the points are, you might think that they're a bit minor, but actually they're the things that hold people back. So people like worried about moving their bank account to a more green investor because it's like, oh, what happens to all my direct debits or whatever? And you talk to someone else in the group that says, oh no, I did that and this was my experience, and that's sometimes all it takes. So there are all these sort of minor things, and a lot of people don't want to act because they're scared of getting told off by their neighbours, or and then when they do it and they find that it's met with enthusiasm rather than being told off, that's brilliant. But it is, barriers don't have to be real, do they? They can be perceived barriers as well that stop us acting. Sorry, like rabbiting on. Sorry, I did see about other questions.
There's quite a lot of
Yeah,
sorry.
So I'll just step in while you have a look, Claire, just to answer the Welsh language side. So yeah, I'm a first language Welsh speaker, and that's why I was brought on as a trainer with Cynnal. And you know, because we've been developing this course, we wanted to make sure that it worked properly. And you know, we've not just you know, kind of directly translated it, because I was keen to make sure that we kind of have a meaningful Welsh language course. And you know, I've been kind of talking to a few people. I was hoping to get Cymdeithas Edward Llwyd on board to help with some ideas about how we could kind of deliver some of the kind of activities and things like that through Welsh. So it's something that will be developed by the end of the year, and we would really love anyone who's here today that has an interest in this and has some ideas to yeah, come along to the working group. And just from Alison's questions there, I've actually been talking to people in Ceredigion area, so the Menter Iaith there. I'm hoping to get on board with some ideas, and we have got funding through Moondance to specifically run Welsh language courses in the Ceredigion area in the next year.
Yeah, for some of the other questions, in terms of people keeping in touch with each other, that's something that we encourage. One Welsh Government course did say, oh, we should have a network, a community of practice about how we implement our ideas. And we were like, yes, that's a very good idea. That's not something that we can help with like right now. But sometimes in the community courses as well, people want to keep in touch. That's not something that we are able to facilitate, and you get all the GDPR stuff as well, but we encourage people. It's like, if you want to stay in touch, put your emails in the chat, then you all have access to them. And you know, so we encourage. We couldn't facilitate that. We just couldn't. That would be a promise we couldn't keep in terms of capacity. In terms of other minority languages, I think that's a beautiful idea. We're not there yet, and we would look to work with partners then who wanted to develop that and take it forward. We also had discussions with some organisations working with adults with learning difficulties that were interested in the course. And again, we said, you know, we are not equipped to be able to deliver the course to that audience, but we would love to work with you to develop your, you know, your own course. So that's, in terms of rolling it out, I think that's our approach. We currently have 2 network partners, so it's Llyn Park Mawr on Anglesey and Denmark Farm in Ceredigion. And yes, hopefully, I think, you know, there are 2 trainers in each of those locations, and hopefully there will be more to come. We've had lots of discussions, you know, how does this link with the National Nature Service in terms of the awareness raising, also with Valleys Regional Park. So, and could there be a train the trainer model? So yes, we'd like to explore all those things. And also, Alison, you mentioned about WLGA. So yeah, Rachel Carter is sort of aware of this, and she's helping us promote it. We've actually had quite a few town and community councillors on the course, which is quite interesting. And then we try and make links between them and the local groups in their area if they're on the same course. I had another thought that's got out of my head. I'll have to jump back in when it comes back.
There was a question around, are the LMPs aware of the training as well, Claire? Have you worked with the LMPs?
Yeah, they're very aware, and
Brilliant.
A lot of the coordinators have been on the courses for the purpose of giving us feedback and helping us, you know, weave in more targeted messages.
Excellent. Well, I think there's a lot more comments in the chat, and I think some of those require you to follow up with them. So I think if you could maybe take a note of the chat, I'm sure we can copy it and send it to you afterwards as well. I think there's lots of opportunities there for further conversations and further development and interest in the course. So thank you both to Claire and to Sarah this morning. It was a really great presentation. Our next presenter is Sam Ward from Climate Cymru, and he's going to give us a quick overview of his work through the Climate Cymru, looking at what the people of Wales and looking at how the people of Wales relate to nature and what they want us to see changed. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sam. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen. Someone jump in if not. But diolch yn fawr, bore da, welcome everyone, and thanks for the chance to talk today. So I'm Sam, as we just mentioned, Sam Ward, and I've worked in biodiversity and campaigning and climate work for, well, I don't know, 15 years now or something, campaigning a lot of it abroad and internationally in the global south, but more recently back home in Wales. And today I'm here to talk about Climate Cymru and some of the activities that relate to nature. So let's start with, so the theme of the talk, as Karen mentioned, is some of the voices and all of the conversations that we've been having with people across Wales about nature particularly. But necessary first to kind of give a bit of a backdrop, a bit of a sort of a background for what Climate Cymru is and how we've been operating. So hopefully you can, so flicking through the slides. So we were born out of a desire from Welsh society to have Welsh voices represented at the UN climate conference COP26 last year, and a sort of like umbrella organization, if you like, to represent sectors across Welsh society outside of the public sphere, and also out of a desire really from a lot of passion in Wales for Wales to do its part as a developed nation to drive this global agreement forwards, and small nation but pushing forward as best we can to make sure that the world does the best version of of what it could have. So that was where we originally came from. So it was a campaign, a time-limited campaign for that. But out of that, this network built really quickly, and we ended up with, at COP26, we ended up with 13,000 people as part of this network, about 60 or 70 ambassadors from around Wales, as well as 250 organisations. And those organisations especially were a real, interesting sort of collection of people. There was universities and unions and businesses, and obviously charities, but charities across interest areas and across silos, and as well as community groups, which also had their own sort of space amongst the Climate Cymru network. So that really quickly became obvious, even before COP26, that there was loads of uses and things that we should be and could be doing with this network, and people were asking certain things of us. And so we kind of came out of that and said, you know what, let's we put it out to the network, and we had hundreds of responses, and they all came back saying, yes, you need to carry on. You've got a lot of work to do, and there's plenty still to do, and there is a space for a sort of umbrella organization, if you like, and so here we are. We have a whole program of activities, which I won't get into now because I want to stay kind of on theme. But so that was, just a few of the sort of ways we work, I suppose, to grapple with next, and how do we sort of theory of change and all that. So the first thing is that is built into what we do is recognizing that there is an interconnected nature to all of these crises. The biodiversity crisis is very closely linked to the climate crisis, and it's impossible to detangle them and deal with one without acknowledging the other. But also beyond that, there is also the cost of living crisis, which is tied to the energy crisis, which is tied to the climate crisis, and which is tied to all sorts of other injustices. And so climate injustice or climate justice is also sort of a theme that runs through all of these. So we have this holistic lens and recognizing that it's all interconnected. And the other thing really is we are really action focused and really trying to unlock action in Wales. And so, a catalyst, I love that sort of idea of being a catalyst. So we're looking across the network, where are the silos that need to be talking to each other? What are the things? And we're speaking to all these organizations, which now, by the way, well over 300 organizations are part of the network now. And how do we unlock change for all of you? How do we make sure you are the best versions of yourselves? And many of the people on the call already are already a part of this network, Canal and RSPB, for example. But how do we help give a national sort of platform to sort of amplify the work that people are doing in communities, on the ground, getting the action done. And so, you know, for example, funding is one of the things that came up time again. So we have a whole portal of like open funds that are available, and we're helping connect funds to people who need it. And as well as a partner we brought on board specifically to match people with, you know, projects with funds. That's just one example, but bridging silos, and sometimes there's a need to sort of take on these issues as you know, in a collective way. And so Climate Cymru is offering a sort of to Welsh society that umbrella potential. So a campaign we've just launched, grappling with the cost of living crisis, grappling with the interconnectedness of the energy crisis and the climate and the cost of living, called Warm This Winter. But I'm not going to get into that today, but just to sort of as an example of what we do. But really embedded in it, which is what I'm getting to today and now, is how we unlock the potential for people all over Wales, organisations all over Wales that wouldn't normally have that much of a say, to genuinely have a say in the changes we can and will and must make to our society. And so, yeah, representing voices was where we were born from at COP26, and we gathered these 13,000 voices, which is now, let's say, 14,000 voices. As we were doing it, we were asking them, what do you care about? What do you know, what is your message to the leaders? What is the things that you were, you know, that touches you most and that you care most deeply about? And so, but we're also kind of making sure people have their say in policy development, and we're sort of acting like a bridge between, you know, and big credit to members of Welsh Government who are being very productively engaging with us and giving us the opportunity to sort of collate and gather input and suggestions and ideas at really early policy development stage, and feeding that in, helping shape the policy, and then again being a soundboard back and forth between this sort of the policies that have been developed and the people of Wales that they'll ultimately affect. So just to break up my talk, and a 40-second little video here. So there's a whole sequence of videos I'm going to show you now. I was kind of laying the foundation, but this is a quick thing about, you know, a quick video that was an intro video as we launched the COP26 campaign, and you know, trying to give people agency and help people understand that they can be a part in the democratic process was a theme of the campaign. But let me just be quiet and show you a 40-second video. So that was just like a launch video, just to give a flavour of the initial sort of you know, agency we're trying to provide. But as we gathered these voices for COP26, there's some really interesting stuff that relates to nature. As we gathered these voices, so we had over 13,500 people, and some people were pouring their heart out to us, and really, you know, absolutely, you know, sort of, you know, really emotional, powerful messages. But as they did it, they also got, you know, there was a bit of a basic survey as people signed up. So they told us what is it that they care most about. And if you see, in fact, I'm just going to play this. This is a pre-recorded. This is a feature that is on our website based off the 13,000 voices that came into us from COP26. So let this play. So this is an interactive data map, and it is taken from data that was gathered on the build up to COP26. So thousands of people from all over Wales, all corners of Wales, fed into this kind of broad campaign to kind of tell us what it is that they care most about, and what it is, you know, why it is that they want action for climate and nature, and you know, what issues do they relate to sort of closely. And so they were given categories as they signed up, so it was a bit of a mini survey, if you like, and these were the categories they were given, and the sort of the rank of the responses. So the most popular, about a third of the people across the board said for future generations is why we need to act. But second behind that was for nature. And so and then here is a whole list of other sort of options that they were given as well. And so that is nationally, but this is interactive and it's on our website, Climate Cymru/voices, climate.cymru/voices. And you can also sort of jump in for and choose your kind of your constituency. So for example, Cardiff Central ranked nature highest of all of the things, whereas others in Cardiff less so. So and interestingly, like for example, Pembrokeshire was another area where there was a high thing for nature. The other feature that is worth drawing attention to here is breaking down based on postcode, sort of regional postcode. So it's anonymized data, but you know, based on the areas that they were fed in from, rural, urban, least deprived, and most deprived, and really powerful, I think, thing that has come from this data set is that across the board, people care about nature. This isn't something that, you know, which is typically sort of thought of as a white middle class thing that people relate to, but actually in rural areas, urban, least deprived, most deprived, and across sort of social demographics and regions of Wales, nature comes up high. So, but interestingly, just slightly higher in the rural areas, 23% versus 17 across the board elsewhere. And so also possible here to segment during, you know, in the regions. And you can say here, for example, nature comes up high in the most deprived areas of mid Wales and the urban areas. So, and you can flick through and there's sort of some interesting analysis there. And again, nature comes high in the most deprived areas of northwest Wales as well. So there we are. That is a data set, and it's you know, just I think. But for me, the most powerful takeaway is that this is not only, you know, this is across the board. People care about this issue. Nature, you know, thousands of respondees with all of these categories, and it consistently came up right near the top. So this is okay, so jumping on then to some of our other activities and some other ways that we've been gathering voices. So Great Big Green Week is one of the activities that we've been engaged with, and that's we've just finished, and so I've just been scrambling since then to kind of get my life back in order and all of the work things that we've been delivering over that. But hundreds of events last week happened around Wales, and that was the largest collection of environmental events that ever happened in Wales. So that's a really exciting kind of moment to be a part of, and also, you know, really inspiring to be a part of, you know. So we, as part of that sort of this explosion of events that are happening around Wales, and the events are celebrating community action and people just getting on with action on the ground. We went around Wales, me and a team of people and ambassadors and campaigners went around Wales to visit as many of these people as possible. And so we went 2 or 3 events a day, every corner of Wales, all sorts of different types of events in electric vehicles. We went around and visited these people and gathered voices and spoke to people. And so you know, my overall, apart from exhaustion at the end of the 8 days of, like, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 events that we visited, was apart from the exhaustion, was actually real inspiration about people in Wales caring about nature, caring about climate, and really getting on with it at a grassroots level. So that's really exciting. And part of that was, you know, one of the things we had a few campaigns running, one this winter I mentioned there, which we've just launched, and there's also a Nature Positive campaign that we've just kind of got going alongside UK Youth for Nature. And Nature Positive, we felt like it was important to, you know, to sort of get that word broadly into society at a, you know, just, you know, understanding what it means and the fact that there is the potential for the great rejuvenation and to recovering our nature, and this narrative of ongoing and increasing destruction is not our, you know, destiny. It doesn't have to be our destiny. So we brought there was a youth campaigner along who I'm going to bring in a second, and pre-recorded message. And in fact, I'm just going to jump straight to it. Enough of my talk. I'm going to pass over to Joe, who has recorded this message.
Hi everybody, thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction and for letting me be a small part of this session. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't be joining you live. Logistics and timings just didn't work out. So I hope you don't mind having a pre-recorded message, and I'm also happy to follow up with conversations after this as well outside of the conference. A little bit about myself. My name is Joe Wilkins. I'm from Aberystwyth, Drio Aberystwyth, and I'm also the head of campaigns at UK Youth for Nature. And we're a youth network that really focus on putting pressure at politicians at all levels, from town councils all the way up to the Westminster government, to make changes for nature that really bring about positive change for nature and make our country, at all industries, all sectors, more nature friendly. As I said, I'm really sorry that I can't be there live with you, because I'm really enjoying the conversations that I'm watching on this conference. But the main reason I'm here is to talk about the Green Tour of Wales that we've recently been on, and I think Sam has mentioned beforehand. And I was really fortunate to be invited onto this to act as a nature representative, to go around Wales talking all about nature, what it meant to people, but also putting it in the context of a global campaign called Nature Positive, which is, as the name suggests, shifting our current trends in biodiversity decline to becoming positive, in that nature is recovering. And not only is nature recovering in terms of numbers, it's recovering in terms of health, in resilience. And so we really need to remember the ecology of this situation. But before I go down my rabbit hole on ecology, the real purpose of this Green Tour, and especially my role, was to go and ask people of Wales what nature meant to them, and to find out what they, when someone mentions nature, what comes to mind. And it was a really enjoyable experience, I have to say, going to different places around Wales, from very rural communities to more urban environments, from north to south, from my own hometown of Aberystwyth, and hearing what nature meant to people. For some people, it was very much a link to food production. For other people, it was, memories of previous generations. But for others, it was the link between mental health, the community health, the mental health of people that really struck me. That people, when they were asked what nature meant to them, really how much they said it made them feel better about themselves. It made them feel more connected to their area. And I think that's what stuck with me. And we've read a lot of research on that, but to hear it directly from people and to have them record videos was such a thrill. And I was so honored to be a part of that. And I hope that for one, small second in the day, people had a chance to think what nature meant to them. Just hearing that from people directly, that there's no substitute. And I would really encourage everybody, especially policymakers, decision makers, and if there's anybody here involved in policy making listening to this, ask people what they think and what it means to them, because that's when you get the genuine, truthful answers. And I'm sure you've either seen the video or you're about to see a video highlighting and showcasing some of these voices from around Wales. And yeah, I was thrilled to be a part, and I would really hope that policymakers will listen as we move forward, especially in the lead up to COP15 with the Biodiversity Conference. It's a big moment for nature, and it's also a big moment for our communities. And I think we need to quickly realize how important that protecting biodiversity, becoming nature positive, is not only preferable, it's essential. And it really is important that our whole attitudes towards nature change. And I hope that will become a nature positive Wales sooner rather than later. Diolch yn fawr.
Okay, so moving straight onto it, this is now a collection of voices. So we said we were about representing voices, but it's also about doing that in innovative and sort of human and direct ways. So this is some of the content, the conversations we had. So let me let this play.
Nature to me means freedom, means health, means greenery, and it means Wales.
It's really beautiful, and if you're really hot, you just go in the sea and it will cool you down.
Nature's always been my source of uplifting nourishment. It's just something which feeds the soul. I always retreat to it when in times of need, and it's just something which you can't really escape from in terms of the rain.
Nature is just all around. It's just the grass and the trees, and you just need to learn to see it. And then you find that it's just everything.
It's the escape from the urban environment that's been built that we cannot escape from. if we are giving more into the community and sharing with each other, it's going to be a lot kinder with each other and to the environment.
I love nature because it's nice and wild and cold or warm, and I have my own garden, and it's just nice to be outside. I love nature because it makes me feel free and peaceful.
Nature is everything to me, both in and outside of work. I've grown up loving nature and still love it now.
The confetti of spring is just taking your breath away.
Nature's my kind of escape, so I think we should preserve that so people after us can have that too.
My father playing by a big beech tree on the edge of Pontypool, and I used to play by the same tree, and future generations still use that tree. His name is carved in there from 1930 or whatever.
Where everybody can go and it's nice and quiet and people live there and it's nice.
I love going out for a walk and seeing the animals, birds and the trees.
We should live on nature and with nature. That's the future I see, and I'm passionate about it.
So we also asked them, everyone we spoke to, what change would you like to see? And so, we had thousands, I don't know, probably thousands, hundreds of conversations certainly during this time, but we capture them all, but we sort of trying to get a flavour of the things that people were asking for and how they would like society to change. So here's another sort of segment, which is what change would you like to see? And this is what the people we spoke to around Wales had to say.
I'd like to see upland forests of Snowdonia reinstated, so the mountains covered in trees again, right to the tops of them, with a strata of the kind of tree line that would have existed thousands of years ago.
So I would like to see more inclusive green spaces and having it a little bit more diverse, and also planting with nature in mind. I'm really big on permaculture, so I'm really trying to recreate that in this garden and make sure we have a lot more food growing, picking and sharing within the community.
I think we can help the planet by planting more fruit trees to enable sustainable living.
For me, it's all about education. It needs to happen in our schools. People need to appreciate what is important about the natural environment and why it's so fundamental to almost everything that goes on in society.
We should stop littering and recycle more.
I'd love to see better access to nature, more people being able to access it. Bikes are a perfect tool.
Let's lead the world in how it should be done.
I'd like to see the government and farmers working together to make nature better.
And for the Welsh Government to actually put pressure and prevent companies like Welsh Water from polluting the environment by discharge of effluent.
Peatlands hold 3 times more carbon than tropical rainforests. They are equivalent to Britain's rainforests.
More talk about marine conservation and climate change.
Governments need to stop prioritising profit over the world we live in.
I would be so grateful if our local authorities would stop using pesticides, insecticides and herbicides at the edges of our grass. It's a terribly simple thing.
I'd like to see the government working more with nature rather than against it in their fight to combat climate change.
So all I'd like to say is if you're going to set targets, it would make it far easier for us on the ground to make them compulsory. End of.
I'd like to see the government tackle the issue of all the sewage being pumped into our environment.
We are promoting our young people to take charge of their own curriculum in ways that kind of has this strand of environmental activism and agency attached to it.
I think the things we need to focus on are actually the little things, like even looking at how we build buildings, such as maybe getting more windows included to promote more natural lighting rather than technological lighting.
Cost of living, well, that's really expensive nowadays. I do believe that we need to grow our own food, guaranteed no chemicals in your growing your own food, or community gardens, get involved with your community.
I like to see mature trees stop being removed for unnecessary reasons. People must learn to appreciate these ancient sort of relics of past generations and for future generations.
The planning applications, my goodness me, been fighting them for years. When will they listen to the environment?
Everybody can be 50% vegan and 50% vegetarian and 50% carnivore, because then the world will be fine.
I'd like to see the government put in more deforestation laws against it, or more limitation on building new housing estates, because, you know, that usually affects wild animal population, especially stuff like hedgehogs, insects, pollinators.
I'd like to see more people look at reusing things and sharing things with the community instead of it ending up in landfills. I think we really need to look at the way we are being heavily consumeristic as a society.
I just would love for us all to just slow down and stop and be late for a meeting because you had to stop and take a photo of a tree, or because you just had to go in somewhere and have a coffee because it was covered in leaves, or just because the confetti of spring is just taking your breath away, and just dancing it. That's what I would really love to see.
So a bit of a flavour, hopefully that the tech will work right to sort of land those messages directly from people all over Wales to you today. And I'll just sort of finish up with a cheeky call to action in terms of just getting involved with what we're doing at Climate Cymru. It's free to join. There's no real catch. You're not obligated to get involved in any particular commitment. There's, you know, you just sign up on the website easily enough. There's opportunities for individuals, ambassadors, or volunteers, or organisations. So long as you find yourself aligned with the sort of climate and nature agenda, and also an invitation for those involved in policy development. We're here and ready to work productively to try and help you capture kind of the hearts and minds of the people of Wales, people on the ground really trying to solve these problems, and helping kind of be a bridge to unlock action on the ground. So we're here, we're welcome, and then I've got the last few minutes, I suppose, to wrap up. To wrap up, I'm going to sort of put it over to questions, and I haven't been on the chat because I've been busy with my screen, so I'm going to stop screen share and hand over to Karen. But thanks very much for the opportunity to talk, and for all the inspiration actually from around Wales. It's really heartwarming. I just went all the way around Wales. The power of and the breadth of people who are passionate about this and genuinely getting busy and acting on climate change, it gives me a lot of heart.
Thank you, Sam. That was a really interesting and powerful presentation. I think, to hear from the people of Wales, it really makes the work that we're doing real, doesn't it? And hearing the action that people want to take on the ground and the passion. There's a few questions in the chat. There's lots of people wanting to get in touch with about the data that you've gathered, how we could work together on the data. There's a question from Sue around, is there a way to enable people who are not online to have their say too? I mean, you have said you've been around Wales, but the ongoing conversation is there another way people can get in touch? Yeah, I mean, the sign up is done through the website, but there is a way. There are ambassadors around Wales, and we are building this network. And so one of the pieces of work that we've got going on at the moment is to start mapping out, because we have these 300 organizations, and amongst those, many of them have their own networks and have hundreds of thousands of people. Even some of them have hundreds of thousands of people within their networks. And so we are in the process of trying to map out a little bit and get a feel for where people are. And like quite a number of groups have set up, after connecting through Climate Cymru, have set up local community groups which are more in-person active and very locally appropriate. And so that's the sort of thing we were doing in Wales. As we were moving around, we were trying to get all the partners from an area to meet in person. So there is lots of ways to engage, and but the nature of the world we live in is that some of them are digital. But people can, and if there is any issues, there is phone numbers, and we're happy to chat online. So we do often get phone. We've got ambassadors ranging up to sort of 80 in their 80s and 90s, and I typically get phone calls from them rather than emails. Brilliant, thank you so much. I think there's lots of people in the chat want to get in touch with you. So maybe once we've handed over to the next speaker, you can have a little look through some of those and follow up with some of those, Sam, because I think you've got another tribe of ambassadors coming your way. Right, I'm going to hand over now. And huge thanks again, Sam. But I'm going to hand over now to Russell Diath from Natural Resources Wales, who's going to talk to us about the national conversation that they've been having in NRW about the future of the natural environment in Wales as well. So I'll just hand over to you now, Russell. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just loading up my slides. I hope they come up okay. That's a really hard act to follow, isn't it? Because, I mean, we've been operating in a very similar space. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the work we've been doing around the national conversation to develop a shared vision for nature and for us for 2050. Now, before I start a deep dive, this week recognises that we need to build a strong foundation for future delivery through capacity building, behaviour change, awareness raising and skills development. We've seen a lot of that today. It seems to be a common theme throughout all of the presentations so far. And we know that nature recovery requires a society-wide approach. So, you know, this is the question that we've been asking. What future do people in Wales want for the natural environment? So I'll be sharing some of the findings from the first phase of that conversation and talking a little bit about what's happening next. We've got some exciting things coming up. So the conversation took place online over a 3-month period between March and May this year, and we promoted the campaign as widely as we could through social media channels and through the help of our partners such as Community Housing Cymru and WCVA. And these are just some of the examples of the online ads that hopefully you would have seen and you would have been involved with yourselves. As a result of that promotional material, we had about over 50,000 visits to the website, and that converted into over 3,000 survey responses, the highest ever for something that NRW's been involved with, so we're really pleased with that. And over 900 registrations for the online workshops and webinars as well. So let's take a look at what people have been saying as part of that national conversation. So we asked what concerns people about the future, and most survey responses that we had, 89% thought that climate change was a global emergency, 91% thought that the nature crisis was a global emergency. So there's a real big kind of awareness from the people who responded to our campaign around that. And the top 3 issues, the first was the decline and extinction of animal and plant life. The second one was climate change and all of the sort of factors around climate change and global warming. And the third was around the pollution of rivers, lakes and groundwater. So survey respondents were also concerned about building on green and natural spaces, plastic pollution and the pollution of the ocean, for example. So we also then asked people, what do they think about different scenarios of the future? I think the most important part of our conversation is imagining the changes that we all need to make to our lifestyle and what might happen if we don't make those changes. And we really wanted to be exploring some of the ways in which our lives might have to change in order to deliver things like, you know, the targets that we've been talking about nature recovery. It's clear from this exercise the elements of those future scenarios that participants found concerning or hopeful for the future, and the report will summarise those in a bit more detail, and you can get hold of that on the website. We asked people what would be a desirable outcome for the future, and contributors offered really vivid and heartening visions for the future, with some common responses falling within these 5 themes. So the first one was sort of a greener, transformed lifestyle. Second was around increased presence and accessibility of green spaces, and we've heard some of those voices in the videos shared earlier talking about those. Local community management of natural resources, increased protection for species and wildlife, and transformation of public transport and active travel. So those were the sort of the biggest themes that came out from that question around, well, what do we want to see in the future? And then there's further themes as well that were very, very kind of consistent across people's responses in relation to sustainable land management and regenerative agriculture, cleaner waters, rivers, lakes and seas, and better marine management, renewable energy, less or no plastic use and less waste, clean air, less pollution of all kinds, no pesticide use, no sewage discharge, more trees and forest, better appropriate woodland management, and sustainable homes and buildings. So it mirrors a lot of the voices that we've just been listening to collectively. And we're drawing on those themes in the second phase of Nature and Us, the work that we've been doing over the summer months up to now, to really start to think about, well, what might that future look like? How might we live in a way that delivers those outcomes? So in our survey, we also asked about the top actions for Wales. And again, none of this will be a surprise to anybody here because it matches a lot of what you've already heard through other such work that's going on. The top action was around recycling, less waste, and reusing goods, less plastic, less litter. So those sorts of issues around litter and waste. The second top action was around progress on green energy and other energy issues around energy efficiency, for example. The third top action was around protecting nature, species, habitats to enable better biodiversity. The fourth was around lifestyles as a whole. How can we sustain healthier lifestyles? Looking at things like circular economy, more nature-focused lives, thinking about education, less materialism, sustainable diets. So again, lots of the voices that you've already heard today. The fifth was around more sustainable, diverse land use and more sustainable farming practices. We had feedback around public transport and active travel, localized solutions, so local food, supporting home working through local hubs, more kind of community initiatives working together, and yeah, particularly looking at some of the products that we might be able to grow or make here rather than importing them from overseas. Less pollution of all kinds was a very common action that we need to take in Wales. As well as improving rivers, seas and lakes for biodiversity and better fisheries management as well. And then finally, more action, more enforcement, co-working, better government and planning policies and more campaigns. So a lot of these marry up with the kind of action areas that are recognised in some of the UN IPBES reports as well. So not really any surprises there, but really good to get that kind of reaffirmation from the people that were involved in this particular survey. And then we asked about changes that people are willing to make. So the majority, 85% of people said they were very willing to make changes to their lifestyles, but over half of those thought they're doing as much as possible already, which is something that we need to really think about. The factors that prevented people from making changes relate to affordability and costs and the lack of infrastructure and government enforced policies. So the changes that people, the most important changes that people are willing to make are around wildlife in gardens and communities, eating local produce when it's in season, and committing to repair and reuse and repairing damaging items rather than throwing them away. So there's much agreement that the main change needed in our relationship with the environment was not to see nature as an asset that humans can exploit, but a strong message that people need to respect nature and exploit it less, and adopt whole-scale changes to their lifestyles and culture. And also as part of that, greater environmental education, and we've heard from the eco-literacy course about how that can really help people understand the severity of the problem and the need to act. Finally, the national conversation strongly suggested there's a need for more enforcement and action around the natural environment. Politicians, government and other organisations should be doing more. Well, it's actually a collective response that's needed right across society. So, but interesting that people kind of put the onus of duty on government and organisations too. So we know that our findings represent views of a very small proportion of the total population in Wales. We've been carefully monitoring the demographics And there were limitations in the fact that we had to use online methods as well, because we were just coming out of the sort of COVID restrictions. So we're clear we need to do more to reach out to different communities and bring people into the conversation. And there's tons of activity already going on across Wales that we should work together and tap into. So the second phase of this work, which we're doing now, we've been running targeted focus groups with young people, including the Youth Parliament representatives, with seldom heard communities right across Wales. And we're having more conversations with farmers and businesses in Wales too. And in doing so, we're capturing individual stories and narratives that sit alongside why people have certain attitudes towards lifestyle changes. And we're working with the arts sector as well to present these in creative ways. So we'd love to capture the kind of the voices and the statistics from the Climate Cymru campaign within that. We're in the process of commissioning an artistic director with a role to curate a new body of artwork that will interrogate the 9 themes that have emerged around the future visions for Wales. So that will draw on the narratives and the stories that we're capturing through the focus groups and roadshows as inspiration, and perhaps even include the eco-literacy poems and the nature positive voices as well. And I'd love to talk to you about how we do that. So once completed, we'll host an event that brings together those artworks and engages with a public audience. And we want to retain them as well as a digital resource for people to be able to access. And then finally, we propose to present all the evidence that we've captured and the narratives we've gathered to a citizens' assembly to help us write that shared vision for Wales. We don't want to be the ones holding the pen on that. We want to give that across to a representative group of people chosen from across Wales. And we're laying the foundations for that right now. We're working really closely with the UK-wide People's Plan for Nature programme, with the RSPB and WWF, so that we can join up our findings and build a truly shared vision that everyone can support. And we hope to be presenting the outcome of that work early in 2023. We'll be using it to support the delivery of the society-wide approach as set out in the recommendations in the biodiversity deep dive to build that strong foundation for future delivery. So thank you for listening today. I hope you found this interesting. The final report the initial report from the Nature and Us conversation, from the first phase of that conversation, is available to download on the web portal. We'll be doing lots of communication around the outcomes from the Citizens' Assembly early in the new year as well. And we hope, as I said, to share the final vision by spring 2023.
Thank you, Russell. We've got a couple of minutes. Has anybody got any quick questions they want to ask Russell at all? I can't see any in the chat. Thank you, Russell. I think another interesting presentation to follow on from Sam. I think again you've got probably a lot of connections to make, and I'm pleased that you're going to be joining up with the RSPB and Nature Positive work as well, so that we're all going to feed into that. I think it'll be, your work is really timely from our perspective as well when we're refreshing the Nature Recovery Action Plan, because it'll be useful to feed that into the process as well as we move forward. So thank you very much for that. There's a question in there, one question has just come into the chat looking at asking how many responses did you get to the questionnaire?
So the questionnaire itself, in the first phase, we had just over 3,000 responses to that survey. And we're cleaning that data set and making it open source. Anybody who wants to have the evidence from that process is able to access that, and that should be available within the next couple of weeks. But we've engaged lots more people through the focus groups, the roadshow events that that have happened over the summer as well. So there's over 1,000 more people that we've been engaging through those processes too. So yeah, it's not just the surveys, but yeah, that's how many responses we had to that particular part of the campaign.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think that nicely brings us to the end of can everybody see me? I've just had a note from Michaela saying She can't see me. Can you all see me?
I can see you.
Oh,
Good.
you've just come up on screen.
Just turned it
Brilliant.
off and turned it on again. Usual IT fix. So yeah, I think that nicely brings us to the end of the session. We've had a really good talk today, a series of talks today, from the high level, what we're doing at that global level around setting the targets and the need for those legally binding targets being set in Wales, through to the local action and the vision that people want. I was really warm to hear actually that there's quite a lot of synergies between those local voices and the targets that are actually being set at that global level. So I think it's going to be interesting in moving forward, and really helping people engage with the future conversations, but also the actions that we all collectively need to take. We do have a shorter session this afternoon. There's going to be an hour's break for lunch, and then at 1 o'clock, there will be a workshop on innovative finance, which is going to be led by Elizabeth Beale. And then we'll have the conference closing speech from Sir David Henshaw. So I hope you'll be able to join us for the afternoon slot of the session. But I would just like to thank all of the speakers here this morning for making the session so interesting. And also thanks to all of you in the audience who've dialed into the session and asked questions. And I hope you've all found it as interesting as I have. So thank you very much, everybody.